everybody. My name is Jack Shelby, and I will be your host on this episode of America Then and Now. Today we will be discussing the topic of Native Americans, specifically talking about the effects of colonization on their livelihood. I have brought in several guests with extensive knowledge on the subject, but before we start, I would like to give you a little bit of background information. Native Americans have been dated to North America as far back as 13,000 years ago. The first major introduction of settlers came in 1607 when Jamestown, West Virginia was established by the British. Immediately upon arrival, Native Americans were affected by foreign diseases brought from Europe. At this time, the overwhelming majority of the Native Americans lived on the east side of the Mississippi River and were extremely prominent in the Midwest and Southeast. This part of the nation is particularly known for its agriculture and wildlife both then and now, hence why the Native Americans decided to live there. Their access to an abundance of natural resources slowly vanished and was eventually taken away in 1830 when the Indian Removal Act was passed. This forced all Native Americans to be removed from the east side of the Mississippi River altogether. Having to adapt to an entirely new habitat and ecosystem, the Native Americans quickly began to utilize the buffalo. Hunting and killing select animals from the massive herds is what provided food and materials for the Native Americans to survive. In a span of 50 years, California was colonized and the Americans had eradicated nearly 20 million buffalo, taking away the main natural resources that the Native Americans had been living on. By 1871, the Indian Appropriation Act made Indian nations no longer sovereign nations and were now completely controlled by the United States. With that bit of background information, it is time for our first guest, Professor Ray Holloway, on the topic of Native American diets.
To run? Nowhere to ride? Now wherever there's carpet, blast off with Fun Slides, the amazing carpet skates that glide, slide, or ride. You decide. Race with them, play games with them, or just cruise with them. Fun Slides bring the good times inside. You don't have to be a pro, just strap them on and go, go, go.
Good morning, Ray. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. So I'm glad to have you on the show. I would like to know a little bit about the diet of Native Americans.
All right. I'm a professor at the University of Wyoming, and I teach Native American Studies. One of my favorite topics to teach is about the changing diet of the Native Americans because people don't realize exactly how much they've changed.
What did the diet of Native Americans look like before the settlers moved in?
So, before the settlers came out west, the Native Americans' diet revolved around hunting, fishing, and gathering. According to William Denome, they raised many varieties of corn, beans, and squashes. Many Indians settled near rivers and streams because the soil was fertile for raising their own plants, as well as being a popular place to find wild-grown herbs, berries, and other plants. What they did not raise themselves, they found while gathering. A study done by Catherine Phillips found that some of the most popular wild plants with the Native American tribes included chokecherries, big hazelnuts, cattail leaf shoots, prairie turnips, wild plums, and raspberries. Even though plants were a large part of the Native Americans' diet, their primary source of protein came from hunting deer, bears, and woodland buffalo. Deer were the most popular animals to be hunted because they were not only providing food, but also clothing, tools, and blankets.
So now my next question is, how did all this change once the settlers arrived?
So it ended up changing a lot. When the settlers began to arrive around the Native Americans' land, the Indians' diet began to slowly change over time. French and English settlers began to hunt so many deer to use for trading purposes that it left little deer for the American Indians to eat for food. In the 1970s, the domestication of animals from settlers began to replace hunting for wild animals. Livestock began to replace deer in the natives' diet. Domesticated cows, pigs, and potatoes were first introduced to the Choctaw Indians. The domesticated animals were not as healthy as wild animals due to their own diets. Domesticated animals were fed with more starch-related foods such as grain. Wild animals led a healthier diet, feeding off of wild plants and berries. This led to increased consumption of fat in Native Americans as domesticated animals were not as lean or healthy. Also, with domesticated plants such as potatoes, the gathering aspect began to diminish. The important nutrients from the wild plants often kept the Indians safe from new diseases. Without these nutrients, the Indians became more susceptible to more diseases and obesity.
How has that all affected the Native Americans today?
Okay, so in today's culture, the Native Americans are also becoming more susceptible to chronic diseases that they had never seen before the colonization of the states. Without the original plant nutrients and hunting wild animals, Native Americans are losing their good health.
Well, Ray, thank you very much for coming on the show. We will see y'all in just a minute.
Thank you.
Don't limit your life to a tiny toilet. Let your imagination soar with a Potty Putter, the instant solution that lets you practice your putting every day.
Okay.
Welcome back, everybody. Now we have a new guest, Hannah Ryder, and she is on to talk about the cultural assimilation of the Native Americans and how they were affected.
Hello, my name is Hannah Ryder. I am a history professor at the University of Wyoming. I have done a lot of research on the cultural assimilation of American Indians, and I look forward to sharing what I have learned with you.
So what is cultural assimilation, and why did Americans choose to culturally assimilate the Native Americans?
Cultural assimilation is a process of one culture changing to resemble another. In this instance, the American Indians were forced to forget their culture. In order to go about the cultural assimilation, Americans forced American Indian children into boarding schools. According to Surface Evans, these boarding schools consisted of training based off of gender. Boys partook in the farm labor, providing milk, eggs, meat, and produce for the school, while girls were trained in basic skills needed to work as domestic servants, such as sewing, cooking, and nursing. While at the school, the children were not allowed to speak their native language or participate in any activity representing their American Indian life. In doing this, the Americans' end goal, according to the Loss of American Indian Life and Culture article, was to get the American Indians to shoot their last arrow, strip off their Indian clothing, put on a pair of white farmers' coveralls, and finally pick up a plow and American flag to prove their conversion from American Indian culture to American culture.
That's very interesting. My last question is, how did cultural assimilation affect the Native Americans and their true culture?
Well, due to their inability to practice their culture, the American Indians lost a huge part of who they were. They were caused to completely rid themselves of how they were raised and were forced to adapt to the American way of living. Sadly, due to the cultural assimilation, a lot of American Indians' lives have been negatively impacted. For example, Delorme shares her story about her belief that her son died due to her inability to be a proper mother as a result of her experience in a boarding school. She also states that the staff were very abusive, physically, sexually, emotionally, and psychologically. Overall, the Americans' choice to force American Indians to convert to the American way of living is a tragedy. In the end, American Indian culture ceased to exist and their lives were permanently affected in a negative way.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah, for coming on the show. We're going to take another quick break, and we will be right back.
Take the work out of your workout. The Hawaii Chair.
Hawaii chair while answering phones, using the computer, balancing books, or filing paperwork.
You can hardly call this work. With the Hawaii chair, it takes the work out of your workday.
If you can sit, you can get fit. The Hawaii Chair.
Welcome back, everybody. We have another special guest. Please introduce yourself and tell us what you have to say.
All right, my name is Dr. Emily Wright. I work with Native Americans all over the country, and I represent them in most legal matters. Consequently, my area of expertise is basically where Natives are today in both America and Australia. I think it's important to consider how Indigenous people are treated in other countries as well as our own, so we can have a full understanding.
Okay, so my first question being, what is the political status of the Native Americans in the United States today?
So as you guys probably know, Native Americans here in the U.S. have a very complicated political status. They are technically members of 3 different states, state meaning political entity. They are members of their tribe, the United States, and the state in which they reside.
So, how has the sovereignty of the tribes been dealt with?
So the governmental status of tribes is very tricky and has faced a lot of issues, especially dealing with sovereignty. The tribes are responsible for governmental actions on their lands, including education, police, maintenance of infrastructure, health care, and many other basic government functions. But even though Native Americans have citizenship, because they have separate governments and their reservations, that facilities and services are often not equal to the rest of the country. There's a large missing Native women crisis in the U.S. their communities are often impoverished, and the education is far from equal. For an example, in 2010, only 50% of natives graduated from high school.
Wow. So I heard you say that your other area of expertise was Australia, so can you tell us a little bit about that?
So in Australia, the situation is still very complicated. There are two main groups of indigenous populations on that continent, the Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islander people. In the 1930s, it was thought that the Aboriginal people would eventually die out, so they weren't too worried about taking care of them. And the population did drop by 70%, but they are still around. They make up around 3% of the population. For a time, the Australian government was separating the children from the parents in order to assimilate them, as we did in the United States, in order to help them into Australian culture. Aboriginal people started being employed only during the 1940s, and that was only because of the war, but they still do not have citizenship. The 1950s were the first time the Aboriginal populations were even counted in the census. Today, this population lives on average 10 years less than the average Australian. There is a large population in prisons, and Aboriginal people are considered wards and not actual citizens of the country. Wardship was originally a gateway to citizenship, but has not been acted upon in that way. It's an in-between state, and the people have to prove they behave the same way as the white Australians.
Dr. Wright, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was great to have you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
After listening to our guest speakers, it is clear that colonization has had a huge impact on the lives of Native Americans. It has affected their diets, culture, education, and overall way of life. The settlers' excitement to live the American dream caused them to ruin any dream that the Native Americans may have had for themselves. With this in mind, it is important that we learn from our past and work to make sure that history does not repeat itself. Thank you very much.